This is it's a lovely tile, a square tile from the 16th century. And we've got Lao Tzu there. Lao Tzu is often pictured on a buffalo. And the story behind that is he got to the Hangu Pass. He gave the volume of his work to the keeper of the pass, and then he went west on the buffalo. And then we don't know what happened after that, but it is a beautiful tile, which was made in Jingdezhen, which has wonderful clay, and so that's a very famous area for its pottery. Doing it risky, Taoist philosophy. In this lecture, I wish to focus on the question, what is Tao in the Taoist tradition, and I'll attempt to show that taking the Taoist path involves risk. I will introduce Taoism by diving in at the deep end with a passage from the Tao Te Ching. This may be a little bit challenging for those of you who have already encountered the Tao Te Ching. It's a short 81-chapter text, and it's not organized in any form or collection of topics, and there are scholars who refuse to engage in a scholarly way with the Tao Te Ching because simply it's just too unwieldy. It's clearly the work of many hands. And it's commonly associated with Lao Tzu, but with, I think, the name Lao Tzu arises because of his association with the text rather than the other way around. Lao Tzu was the author of the text. Its other name, the Tao Te Ching, arises from the topics it covers, Jing meaning canon, and Tao, which I'll try to explain a bit of today, and which I'll try to explain a bit of today, but more so in lecture 5. So the passages of the Tao Te Ching are also extremely cryptic. It's difficult to get an overall sense of where it's going. It looks like it's poetry, but its lines don't really rhyme most of the time. And although there is a sense of rhythm and meter, sometimes I think it's written to be read aloud rather than silently to oneself. In particular, if it's read out not in Mandarin, but in Cantonese, which apparently is much closer to the spoken form of Chinese during the Warring States period. It actually rhymes. If you look up YouTube for a reading of the Tao Te Ching in Cantonese, it sounds a lot better than reading it in Mandarin. We will also today look at some passages from the second Tao Te Ching text, the Zhuangzi. So here are imprints of the two texts. The one to the left, a Ming Dynasty manuscript held in the National Palace Museum, Taiwan's collection, and you'll see chapters 1 and 2 of the Tao Te Ching. The section of the Zhuangzi to the right is interesting. It has been thought of as a manuscript from the 8th century during the Tang Dynasty, and this was discovered in Dunhuang, some caves around the early 20th century. A lot of manuscripts were discovered and taken, so they're in the process of being given back. But this is a replica published in 1932, and for those of you who've been following these lectures, you can see too that the characters are large and small, the large being the text and the small being the commentaries on the text. So these are the two defining Taoist texts of the Warring States period, Warring States being the period from 475 to 221 BCE. There is a third text, the Liezi, which contains passages from both the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. It's not clear that it was a text, it is a text that belongs to the Warring States period. I think scholars now believe that it's a later text that copied sections from both these texts. So on to Tao Te Ching 2. It's a passage that covers a range of key ideas in the Tao Te Ching, and I'll walk us through it using the passage to provide an overview of the themes in Taoist philosophy. So let's begin. When all under heaven know beautiful as beautiful, there is ugliness. When all know good as good, there is not good. The opening lines of this passage portray how conventionally we organize our lives. We're taught to see the world through the language we use to describe it. We learn not only what words mean and what they refer to in the world, but also we absorb the attitudes conveyed through specific words. For example, when we know the word beauty, that is, when we use it in our communication with others, in our own thinking, and to make sense of the world, we learn to identify beautiful things. We might also internalize a desire to be beautiful. And we learn to avoid what is ugly. Sometimes the words we use and how we use them also compel us to see the world in black and white ways. Something is either beautiful or not, good or not. The Tao Te Ching is concerned about how our engagements with the world are mediated by the ways in which we have been taught to perceive it. If I were translating this passage in line with what I've said so far, this is what I'd have. When all under heaven know beautiful as beautiful, there is ugliness. When all know good as good, there is not good. This translation brings out how language focuses our thinking and shapes the way we organize our lives and perceive the world as we communicate with others and collaborate with them on shared projects. Now on to the next part of the passage. Being and non-being generate each other, difficult and easy complete each other, long and short shape each other, above and below fulfill each other, tone and voice harmonize with each other, before and after follow each other. In contrast to the two opening lines, these polarities articulate how Taoist philosophy sees the world, not in terms of either-or categories, but in relational terms. However, simply to speak about relationality does not do justice to the varied types of interdependency we see here. In this list, each term mutually influences and shapes its counterpart in different ways. The Chinese expressions for each of these lines include the term mutual that's been left out of this translation, partly because it's implied by each other. But if one were to translate them faithfully, you would have this: being and non-being mutually generate each other. One might see the addition of the mutually as redundancy, but I'm just bringing it up to show that that's what's there in the text. The mutuality is quite pronounced. And the word mutual runs right down the six polarities. Our task, I think, is not to try to figure out how exactly difficult and easy complete each other, or how above and below fulfill each other. Rather, we should focus instead on the varieties of interdependencies, telling us about how things impact on each other. Why would it be important for the Tao Te Ching's authors to highlight these interdependencies in the text? The motivation for doing so, I suggest, arises from the recognition of change, a topic we covered in the first lecture. In other words, because the world is constantly in flux, and because the 10,000 things, the One Wu, you'll see mention of One Wu coming later on in the passage, it's a way of capturing everything that exists. Because the 10,000 things each have different interdependencies with other things, we need to understand the subtleties of interdependence. This might be an approach to life that, this picture, the last 6 lines, might be an approach to life that we contrast with another that sets up clear boundaries between things, ostensibly to help us see better, as captured in the opening 2 lines. So the Taoist picture of mutual generation, completion, shaping, fulfillment, harmonization, and following gives us a vocabulary to see not only the type of relationality between the 2 polarities, but to understand that there is a continuum of possibilities between each set of polarities. That is, to speak of generation or harmonization brings out the ongoing dynamic relation between the respective sets of polarities. These relations are not conceived of in either or terms, nor are they static. When we compare these 2 approaches, we begin to realize that Taoist philosophy's concerns are not simply with what Confucian norms or Moist norms, or for that matter, what any set of conventional norms are committed to. The problem, as the Taoists see it, is that if we navigate the world predominantly guided by these single sets of standards, we might miss seeing the deeper dynamic relationalities between aspects of the world. In grasping Taoist philosophy, we need to move beyond its rejection of conventional values to its more profound critique of how we organize our lives on the basis of such values. The next part of the passage focuses on how the sage avoids prescribing a particular model of achievement for everyone. Therefore, the sage handles tasks through non-action, Wu Wei, and proceeds by instructing without words. The 10,000 things, the one who arise, but the sage does not initiate. They come into life, but the sage does not possess them. The sage acts on them, but does not rely on them. This section of the passage focuses on Wu Wei, a well-known term in Taoist philosophy, and particularly in the Tao Te Ching. The term is often translated as non-action, and that is how I translate it too, though not without qualification. Importantly, Wu Wei is by no means a view that advocates sitting and watching as the world goes by. As we see in the passage, the Taoist sage undertakes tasks, but he does so in a particular way, and he instructs without words. This is important. We have just seen how, with words in the first 2 lines of this passage, we can create sharp delineations between opposites. It seems that while the sage acts, he does not seek to control or manipulate the 10,000 things. And here is the last portion of Tao Te Ching 2. Deeds are accomplished, but the sage does not dwell in his accomplishments. Only because the sage does not dwell in his accomplishments, they do not depart from him. The sage has work to do. Wu Wei is interpreted in terms of the sage's not being driven by his goals or successes. Later in the lecture, I'll return to discuss the nature of Wu Wei. I hope my analysis of Tao Te Ching 2 has given you a rough picture of some of the key concerns of Taoist philosophy, and some questions too. Some of the points that I want to recap are its resistance to promoting particular sets of standards or practices, and its sense of the dynamism that is a central part of life. I'd now like to take our analysis further by considering 2 questions for the rest of this lecture. First, what is Tao? And secondly, what is unique about Taoist Tao? Tao literally means way, path, or teaching, or insight. It could be used as a noun, as in, this is Buddhist teaching, or this is the Confucian path, or it could be used as a verb, as in, this is how we convey Moist doctrine. Taoist philosophy offers a different and unique conception of Tao to other traditions, in that it doesn't merely articulate a view that's different from all other views. It scrutinizes the impact of these other views on our lives. And I believe it also offers an approach to life, a Tao that does not seek to prescribe a particular model of human flourishing, but which allows individuals to foster their virtuosities. In simpler terms, we might say that Taoist Tao seeks to allow individuals to play to their strengths. This sounds paradoxical, though. How can a text offer an approach to life, yet not uphold its model of human flourishing? And this is one of the difficult questions that I'll try to work through tonight. Let us look at what the opening statement of the Tao Te Ching says about Tao. So this is from Tao Te Ching, chapter 1. The first line has 6 characters. Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao. And you will see that there are 3 occurrences of the character Dao. The Dao in the middle is a verb, and that's what interpreters and scholars agree on. The way this is normally carved out, just very, very quick translations of each of the character. The Tao, Ke is possible, or can be, that's admissible. The Tao that is possible to communicate or travel along or to convey, it has this sense of conveying an idea. The Tao that is possible to convey is not, that character Fei is negation, is not, and the last 2 characters, Chang, can have a range of meanings, enduring, constant, absolute, unvarying, as some translators have it. So put together, the Tao that can be conveyed is not the absolute Tao. So now we get a sense that the first Tao and the second Tao are qualitatively different. The second Tao, sorry, when I mean the first and the third Tao, the 2 Tao nouns are qualitatively different. One set that can be conveyed or transmitted, the other that is absolute or unchanging, that presumably, by contrast, cannot be conveyed, and that is the absolute Tao. So those are just very rough translations, and I've got the English there for you. The Tao that may be spoken or communicated is not the enduring Tao. And that's the pinyin for the characters. Now, of course, when we're trying to translate this into English, we have to put in articles. We have to put in ers or thers, and typically the definite article is used to translate Tao. Not always, as we'll see in a range of translations here. By Juvendak, the way that may truly be regarded as the way is other than a permanent way. By Lin, the Tao that can be told of is not the absolute Tao. By Wei Li, the way that can be told of is not an unvarying way. You get the drift. What is interesting comparing across these translations in particular is the insertion of the article before the third Tao, that is the third noun Tao, the unvarying way. You can see, for instance, Juvendak has the way, Lin has the absolute Tao, whereas Wei Li uses an indefinite article, an unvarying way, and the others use the. There are some others who use the as well. There is a critical difference, and this is a significant philosophical difference. whether one uses the definite or the indefinite article. The definite article suggests there is only one Tao, whereas if you look at, for instance, Whaley's translation, the way that can be told of is not an unvarying way, so there could be a variety of unvarying ways. So this, the translation of, or rather the insertion of the definite article in relation to the absolute Tao has given traction to the understanding of Tao in philosophical discussions as a metaphysical concept. It's that Tao, it's perhaps reality. And this interpretation has arisen in part due to efforts of scholars in the modern period to establish the validity and legitimacy of Chinese philosophy as philosophy. And there has even been comments to the effect that, look, the Tao Te Ching's Tao in the opening statement sounds very, very much like Plato's reality and appearance. The Taos that can be told, that's appearance, and this is reality. In my view, much as the metaphysical understanding of Tao as reality helps to advance the claim that ancient Chinese thought bears elements of Western philosophical thinking, it is not, or not the only conception of Tao we should consider. And there is one other reading, and that's the reading I much prefer and that I'll take us through for the rest of the lecture. So this is the conception of Tao as discourse, not as reality or metaphysical reality. What do I mean by discourse? What do I mean by Tao as discourse? Well, when I first opened introducing the idea of Tao, I suggested that the broad understanding of Tao during the Warring States period is as a way or a path or a doctrine or a teaching. So you have Confucian Tao, you have Maoist Tao, you can have Buddhist Tao. And each of these Taos may be considered a discourse in the very broad sense. So I'm trying to move Tao away from the metaphysical reading. When we think about Tao as discourse and what I mean by discourse, well, if you think broadly about the nature of discourse, it frames and structures our interactions according to a particular vision. As discourse, a Tao locates us in shared social environments within which we and others make sense of life. We share a discourse. When we share a discourse, we orientate ourselves to the values promoted within that discourse. We evaluate how our projects and goals align with it, and we gravitate to other people and groups who also subscribe to this vision. So in that way, Tao becomes a guiding discourse. You can see how Confucian Tao provides a comfortable locus for people to live within and to transact their business. In brief, a discourse in this broader sense helps us to walk the walk, to walk the talk, and it expects us to do so. So for the remainder of this lecture, as I've noted, I will focus on the second conception of Tao, that is Tao as discourse. And from this angle, thinking about the opening line of the Tao Te Ching, which are the Taos that can be communicated? Is there a correct Tao? Going back to this, if we take Tao as discourse, is there a correct Tao? Does Taoist philosophy recommend a correct Tao? So back to looking at this opening line. I was thinking about this, looking for a long time actually at these opening lines and these 6 characters as I wrote this lecture. And of course, I've considered this opening statement many times, but I've had new thoughts about it. So in some ways, you're my guinea pig. So sorry. The orthodox interpretation of this line, divided in this way, places weight on the absolute Tao. If someone says to you, the Tao that may be communicated is not the permanent Tao, where would you gravitate to? The permanent Tao. And you would interpret Taoist philosophy as saying, look here, all of you who are engaging in your Tao proposals, well, they're the ones that you're trying to communicate. But let me tell you this, mine is the permanent one, which also implies it cannot be communicated. But I wonder if the focus grabs the wrong end of the stick. So let me put that in there. According to the way the 6 characters are cut up is Tao that can be told is not enduring Tao. So you've got these 2 blocks and they don't line up. And the focus is typically on the second set. But perhaps, and it's entirely possible, that the Tao Te Ching's emphasis is not on the pursuit of this absolute Tao. It could be that the emphasis is on the ones that can be spoken. And if you focus on Tao Ka Tao, which is the subject that the statement opens with, the Taos that can be communicated, well, none of them are enduring. There is no permanence, nor is there superiority to any of these communicated Taos. And in other words, and this is where the Tao Te Ching may be said to have a distinctive view, no one creator of a Tao, Confucius or Mois, should assume that their proposal is the correct one. According to this view, the Tao Te Ching's opening line is, the Tao that can be told is not an absolute Tao. The Taos that can be told are all we've got. Let's not go seek those ones there. If this is the case, we need to proceed without an absolute objective guiding plan that covers everyone. There is a significant advantage of reading the opening statement of the Tao Te Ching in this way, because the orthodox interpretation, as I've noted already, creates a very tricky paradox concerning the Tao Te Ching as a text. If the Tao Te Ching holds that all transmittable Taos are not absolute Taos, why wouldn't that statement hold for its own views? For this opening statement as well as for the entire text, if all Taos that are communicated, what are we doing with the text, the Tao Te Ching? What is it trying to communicate then? With the reading I suggest here that no Tao is an absolute Tao, we do away with the paradox very quickly, and we don't get into the trouble of the Tao Te Ching's saying something it tells its readers cannot be said. To recapitulate, so this is what I've offered so far. There are 2 conceptions of Tao. First, Tao as reality, which I very quickly brushed aside, and went to Tao as discourse, which is what I would, which is how I propose we should understand the Taoist conception of Tao. And then under this conception of Taoist discourse, we still have, given the opening statement, two ways of thinking, well, what does the Tao Te Ching say about Taoist discourse? The first is, well, let's go seek out what is correctly the Tao Te Ching's correct discourse. And the second, which I've just proposed, is that the Tao Te Ching takes it that there are many different discourses, many different ways of life, many different proposals, but none of them is the absolute one. We're stuck now, because if there is no absolute one, how do we live? And I'm going to take you through now to a Taoist picture of, I'm trying to validate this view that there is no single correct discourse through thinking about a particular mode of life that is particularly important in Taoist philosophy, an engaged life. And I'm going to use that to substantiate this idea that there is no single correct discourse. According to Taoist philosophy, the promotion of a particular guiding discourse hinders a person's engagement with the world. That's why it doesn't like that absolute discourse, and we've already seen hints of that coming through to us in Tao Te Ching too. The problem is compounded when entire societies share in a particular discourse and values and practices become entrenched. Our fixed ways of apprehending the world dumb our perception of what actually goes on. And here we see the early lines of Tao Te Ching chapter 12 about how being taught a particular way actually dumbs down our perception of the world. The 5 colors blind one's eyes, the 5 tones deafen the ears, the 5 tastes cause the mouth to be damaged. 5 was a number that's frequently alluded to in early Chinese culture. You have the 5 elements or the 5 phases, and then you've got 5 colors, 5 tones. And so these are the ways of classifying the world. To teach a learner the 5 color terms, the 5 musical tone names, or the 5 flavor terms is not, as commonly assumed, to extend the learner's knowledge. To teach a learner 5 colors is to teach him to see colors the way his teacher or his society does. The issue is not that we should teach more color terms, or more tones, or more tastes. The passage's concerns are not primarily about education as such, but about the epistemological practices associated with an unquestioning and unexamined life. To elaborate on this point, we could understand this passage as a rejection of knowledge, but that really is not its point. Rather, the passage specifically addresses the prescriptivity of our norms and practices. Not only do they tell us where to look, they also condition how we look. Our capacities are then acculturated to operate in particular ways. Engaging with the world was something many or most of the Warring States thinkers thought about. However, there's something quite compelling about Taoist philosophy's particular focus on the human condition. Where we are situated and how we are situated is in some way constitutive of our agency. Both the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, especially the latter, focus on the many facets of our world that are irreducibly woven into our existence. It is sometimes suggested that while the Confucians sought to organize life in the socio-political domain, Taoist thinkers were more concerned about the bigger picture, about humanity within the natural environment. I'm not sure I agree with this way of articulating Taoist philosophy's high points. In my view, the Warring States Taoist texts were interested in human capacities and more generally the kinds of beings we are. Their aim, I believe, was to understand the limits of humankind, as well as to grasp the extent to which we are able to maneuver and negotiate our way in the world. In consequence, their reflections cover questions about heaven and earth, the phenomena in the natural world, flora and fauna as well. But the Taoist concern is not so much the natural world as such, I suggest, but it really is to focus on humanity's interdependencies with the world. In both the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, the idea of heaven, Tian, is evoked to help scope the limits of human life. Life and death, our embodied constitution, natural forces and their effects, climactic and weather events, these are all attributed to heaven. A passage in the Zhuangzi does exactly this by delineating the work of heaven and the work of humanity. And this is a conversation between Ra of the Northern Sea with the river god. Ra of the Northern Sea, typically in the Zhuangzi, has this very enlightened view that the Zhuangzi itself holds. So this is partway through a conversation where the river god is saying, well, how do we understand the reach of heaven and humanity? How are they placed in relation to each other? And Ra of the Northern Sea replies, oxen and horses have 4 legs. This is what I call the heavenly. Haltering the horse's head and piercing the ox's nose are what I call human. This is fairly straightforward. Therefore I say, do not let what is human obliterate, sorry, there shouldn't be an off there. Do not let what is human obliterate what is the heavenly. Do not let resolve override the conditions of life, and do not seek to acquire at the expense of your name. Conscientiously watch over and never lose sight of the heavenly. This is what I call returning to what is genuine. This I see as an articulation of an attempt to orient humanity in relation to what is there, the given conditions of life, which Zhuangzi typically calls heaven, and to understand how actually not to cross the boundary. So we have seen in other Chinese traditions heaven as an anchor for morality. It's not quite here. The use of heaven here marks out a boundary, a hard and fast boundary, it seems, a necessity that humans must heed. This passage is not about not haltering animals. It does not reject, rather it recognizes the actions of humanity. But our actions must align with the conditions of life, articulated in the term Tian as well as in the term Ming, the conditions of life, often translated fate or destiny. Again, while the idea of alignment between heaven and humanity is also present in other early Chinese traditions, there's often an emphasis on a moral partnership. But there is little sense here, if at all, of a transcendent moral agentive heaven. Yet there is a warning that human endeavors should not drown out, and that's the character Mie, obliterate the heavenly. Now, what kinds of human endeavors obliterate the heavenly? In the first instance, the ingrained formulaic responses that are barriers to our interactions with the world. Singular prescriptive models of flourishing obscure our perception of what is out there and deny us the opportunity for a fuller, more spontaneous engagement with the world. All we're expected and equipped to do, according to these prescriptive traditions, is to draw a leaf from a playbook that has been handed to us. Not so for the Taoists. There is a phrase in Taoist philosophy that captures the exercise of initiative in a person's engagement with the world, and this is 自然, which may be translated as natural, naturally, sometimes spontaneous, or self-so. In Warring States Taoist debates, 自然, I believe, is best translated as self-so. 自 means the self, and ran means so, like this. it conveys the idea of dynamism, and it's associated with fire, so it's dynamic. 自然 refers to a process or possibly also a set of capacities that allow an individual's dispositions to be expressed in the unfolding of events as the individual encounters the world. It's quite a mouthful. To say this more simply, 自然 captures the idea of an individual being able to act in an environment without having been conditioned to respond in a particular way. The Taoist focus on 自然 turns the spotlight on individuals, and this, I believe, is a unique aspect of Warring States Taoist philosophy. To promote individual initiative would have been a radical move. This philosophy encourages people to take things into their own hands. What does this involve? How do the Taoists conceive of individual agency? In other words, if individuals are not to be guided by the norms of a shared discourse, how are they to act? By contrast, one benefit of a system that entrenches the familiar is that it gives comfort to people, whereby they know exactly where they stand. And this works even better if our common discourse is shared by more people. Imagine how a shared language of benevolence and propriety helps create a comfort zone for us all. Remove this, and where does the individual stand? Risk. Scholarly discussions of Taoist philosophy often applaud the opportunity it offers for individuals to be released from the norms that constrain us. These debates have been couched in terms of freedom, with various nuances and varieties of accounts of freedom. However, there has been little recognition of Taoist philosophy's awareness of the risks involved in a life that is both more engaged and less guided. Naturally, more could go wrong, even though the level of risk varies from activity to activity. In talking about risk, I'd like to focus on a story in the Zhuangzi, the story of the wheelwright and the Duke Huan, to articulate the Zhuangzi's cognizance of the implications of acting without being directed by prescribed goals. So in this story, which is wonderfully crafted when you read it many times over, the wheelwright is in the hall below, working on his wheel, working on carving a wheel. The Duke is in the hall above reading his book, and the wheelwright puts down his tools, gets up to the upper hall, which is already a transgression of boundaries, so to speak, because the lower hall is where he belongs, doing what he does in his manual activity. He goes up to the upper hall and he starts questioning the Duke. What are you reading? He says. Let's look at the story. Duke Huan was reading a book in the upper hall while wheelwright Bien was chiseling wheels below the hall. Putting down his hammer and chisel, the wheelwright ascended the hall and asked Duke Huan, saying, "Might I ask your honor whose words you are reading?" So he's careful to be quite polite, but still, just going up there to ask precisely whose words the Duke is reading is already bold. Duke Huan replied, "The words of sages." Are the sages still alive? Dead long ago. In response, in spite of the fact that the Duke has bothered to answer him, Bien is absolutely rude, headlong, I would say, because he says, in that case, what you, sir, are reading are the sediments of dead men of old. Duke Huan said, "How can a wheelwright think it is apt to opine on the books that I read? If you have an explanation, fine. If you do not have an explanation, you will lose your life." It's such a wonderful story. And we are never told, when we get to the end of the story, we're never told if he's lost his life. That's part of the intrigue, I think, of the Zhuangzi. So the treasured words of the sages, a feature of the Confucian tradition, are disparaged by the wheelwright. The incensed duke demands an explanation. And Bien is even given a chance to respond, which you think is kind of borders on fantasy, after having been so rude. So Bien then gives a response. He says, speaking for myself, I see things in terms of how I handle my work. When I carve a wheel, if I hit the chisel too gently, it slides along but does not take hold. If I hit too hard, it jams and can't go further. Not too gentle, not too hard. I feel it in my hand and respond to it with my heart mind. I cannot put this into words, even though I grasp what is involved there in the midst of the activity. If you've tried working with a chisel, you know that's exactly right. You don't get the angle right, or it's too light, it just slides, and then if it's too hard, it wedges. The examples used in the Zhuangzi are just so accessible. He presents this first-person account of how he undertakes wheel carving. He talks about how he acts. He handles wheel carving responsively. He brings up the heart mind, which is a capacity, particularly that the Confucians discuss as well as the key moral capacity in Confucian philosophy. It is interesting the way the story is crafted, that when called to account for ridiculing the words of sages past, Bien evokes a model of manual work. How is this even relevant to the sort of thing the sage does? And this manual work, of course, is the only work that Bien knows. Maybe the story is making a point that from the angle of wheel carving, the duke may learn to be a good duke. If so, this story turns the tables on who has moral prestige and authority. But this is not the only contrast in the story. Unlike the words of former sages, Bien's account is personal and not universalizable. The experience is Bien's own, not somebody else's. By contrast, you know what I'm going to say already, those who attempt to learn from the words of the sages are learning second-hand from somebody else's experiences. Third, Bien embodies Tao in his activity. His success, in the relevant sense, comes from doing, not from grasping a set of ideas. To succeed in what he is doing, accordingly, for the Duke, Duke Huan needs to embody Tao in his interactions with the people. It's not codifiable, it's a form of doing. Finally, Bien acts responsively in wheel carving. His actions are in the moment, working out what he needs to do next, every step of the way. Perhaps the Duke is a good reader and he has a capacity to read responsively. But the relevant question here is not about whether he reads responsively, but whether he can govern responsively. I should emphasize that I believe this story is not intended to stop Duke Huan from reading. The focus is on, rather, what it takes to be a good Duke. The suggestion is that Bien is a good wheelwright because he has been in his workshop. And the Duke's workshop, Bien suggests, is not to sit in the upper hall reading the words of sages past. Now, the final portion of the story is most interesting. Bien goes on elaborating on his personal experience. He says, I cannot impart my understanding to my son. He cannot receive it from me. So, at the elderly age of 70, I'm still carving wheels. When the men of old died, what they could not transmit died too. Therefore, what you, sir, are reading must be the sediments of dead men of old. These comments dwell on the transmission of Tao, or perhaps of its impossibility. They highlight the ways of being the wheelmaker and being the duke. Bien speaks of his failure in transmitting wheelmaking to his son. There is an important analogy here, though it's not explicit. Just as Bien has failed to transmit his abilities and insights to his son, so will the sage's words fail insofar as the aim is to transmit them. As Bien has failed to teach his son, likewise, the culture of transmitting sage's words to guide our moral lives will fail. Hands-on seems to be the model here. It's a prerequisite for responsiveness. Duke Huan will need to get into the world where he interacts with the people. Bien's son, too, will need to work out for himself how to be a responsive wheel carver. Listening to his father's instructions is not going to help him. For a different reason, we also wonder if Bien is the best teacher. Bien makes wheels freehand, with hammer and chisel, and perhaps working freehand is not how learners should begin. Most craftsmen would have used standard measuring instruments to help in their work, the compass and the square. And this is not stated in the story, but readers you just need to work it out for yourself about what the prevailing practices are. This is a reproduction of an old of a compass, and that is a lodestone or magnetite. So the whole idea of compass and square, Guiqi, is a very significant term in Warring States philosophy and beyond. Guiqi literally means the instruments compass and square, but in the Confucian texts, you already see its metaphorical uses as moral standards. And you see that right across the Confucian texts, used particularly in the Shenzi, for instance, that talks about moral cultivation quite a bit. And it was used metaphorically to refer to the importance of having reliable standards. The ways of the sages, going back to Duke Huan's book, the ways of the sages served as compass and square for all who aspired to Confucian Tao. Nowadays, in colloquial Mandarin, when you say Guiqi, you mean it can mean a whole range of things. You can mean literally compass and square. It can also mean common practices or standards of morality. So you could comment on someone who cuts the queue, for instance. You say, he's not following the acceptable standards. Let's see what Zhuangzi has to say about compass and square. To depend on the carpenter's curve and line, compass and square to straighten things, is to pare away its nature. To bow and crouch according to ritual propriety in music, and to welcome and eulogize benevolence and righteousness in order to comfort the hearts of the people of the world, is to lose the naturally enduring, evolving condition of all things. Bien does not use compass and square. He does it freehand. He does not need measuring instruments. But his freehand carving is risky. It's certainly more risky than the safe option. So in the story about Bien, the passage does not describe the quality of his wheels, but it's reasonable to surmise that his carving freehand is a sign of his expertise. At the very least, he knows enough to tell us that chisels might slip or wedge too fast in the wood. Moreover, the Zhuangzi has many stories about people who demonstrate a high level of expertise in what they do. They might perform or create better, or more elegantly, or more sensitively, and so on. For example, there's a butcher who has not needed his knife sharpened in 19 years, but he guides his knife, because he guides his knife through the small space between the joints of oxen. Part of this story, this is according to the butcher, a good cook changes his knife once a year because he cuts. A mediocre cook changes his knife once a month because he hacks. I've had this knife of mine for 19 years, and I've cut up thousands of oxen with it, and yet the blade is as good as though it had just come from the grindstone. There is a cicada catcher, and we'll look briefly at that story in the next little while, who catches cicadas with his stick as if he was simply grabbing them with his hand. Then there is a bell stand maker who makes exquisite bell stands, woodworker Ting, who carved a piece of wood and made a bell stand. When it was finished, everyone who saw it marveled, for it seemed to be the work of gods or spirit. There are many others in there who impress. There are different levels of risk, of course, across these stories of people working freehand. Chisels could slip, there could be botched bell stands, and the ferryman and the swimmer could drown. The masters can do better without compass and square, but they could also do worse. They're putting themselves on the line, but in the Zhuangzi, of course, they impress. Some of them have audiences who are excited about and intrigued by how the masters do what they do, and they ask the master how he has learned to do so well. So this brings us to a final question on risk I'd like to explore, and that is, can we learn to carve freehand, as it were, to mitigate risk, and if so, how? So when asked about their skill, the masters' replies highlight the paths they've each taken to develop their capacities for handling their respective tasks. They provide personalized accounts. None of these are easy, and the capacities are cultivated typically over long periods of time. They're not easy because they're not structured according to a learning plan. In fact, there are no teachers in any of these stories. I will use a portion of the story about the cicada catcher to illustrate what the masters have to go through, or some of them, or the cicada catcher anyway, to acquire capacities for responding in the moment. The cicada catcher in the text is called a hunchback. So when I say these words, I feel bad because they sound so rude. But the Zhuangzi deliberately uses them, and in lecture 5 you'll see there are quite words deliberately chosen by the Zhuangzi text to convey how some people look grotesque, as it were. So Confucius watches the cicada catcher catching cicadas with a pole, the sticky end of a pole, and is quite impressed by his success. And then Confucius says, well, do you have Dao? The cicada catcher says, I have Dao. For the first 5 or 6 months, I practice with 2 pellets piled up on my pole. If they don't drop, it means I'll lose very few cicadas. When I could balance 3 pellets without dropping them, I'd lose only 1 cicada in 10. When I was able to balance 5 pellets without them falling off, I could catch cicadas as if I was picking them up with my hand. I position my body like a gnarled tree trunk, and I hold my arm like an old dry branch. No matter how expensive heaven and earth are and how innumerable things are, I'm aware of nothing but cicada wings. Neither turning nor leaning, I do not let the 10,000 things take the place of cicada wings. How can I not succeed in taking them? These details tell us how the cicada catcher becomes an expert cicada catcher, impressing Confucius by taking on an arduous learning program. The way he describes what he has learned shows an attunement to a deep awareness of the habits of cicadas, as well as cicada environments. And if you can recall the passage about what is the human and what is the heavenly, and the importance of aligning the human with the heavenly, we can see the cicada catcher actually modeling that. He understands what he needs to do. There are some things that don't give, for instance, cicada habits, or cicadas that will be scared by sharp movements. And these are the things he believes he needs to do in order to be able successfully to catch them. These are the given conditions that he works with. He cannot change, and therefore there are ones that he can change, which is his own behaviors. With the right kinds of capacities for acting responsively, then this story shows how the cicada catcher mitigates risk. In this story, there probably is little risk. I guess he could fall off the tree, or he could end up a day catching few cicadas, but it also shows how one can excel. Earlier, I noted that Taoist philosophy's focus on individuals taking things into their own hands turns our attention to initiative and agency in a way that would have been radical during the Warring States period. Let me now bring this lecture to a close by reflecting on human agency in light of Tao. The opening passage of the Tao Te Ching is often understood as a call to seek that true or absolute Taoist Tao. However, I believe we should take a somewhat different view of Taoist philosophy. In my view, Taoist philosophy does not aim for some absolute guiding discourse, simply because there should be none. What this means is this: there are many Taos, but none of them should be promoted as a guiding Tao. It seems that the Chuang-Tzu's masters have developed their own Taos. Returning to the cicada catcher story, as you read later on, I'll show you a bit of Confucius' response, we have to wonder if Confucius has missed the point. He doesn't seem to have realized that what the cicada catcher articulates is a very personalized Tao. At the end of the story, Confucius turns to his followers and teaches them about the cicada catcher's Tao. Confucius said of the cicada catcher, he keeps his will undivided and concentrates his spirit. Is this not what we say about the venerable hunchback? Why do I say Confucius might have missed the point? Will the cicada catcher's Tao work for Confucius and his followers? The cicada catcher is a hunchback. There must be something in there. Perhaps that makes him better at crouching. Or perhaps the cicada catcher has developed a hunchback because of his crouching for cicada catching. We're not told. Confucius condenses all that the cicada catcher has told him into a one-liner. All the initiatives, the personalized physical tasks undertaken by the cicada catcher are omitted in Confucius's words. The Confucius figure, apparently the advocate of Taoist wisdom for his followers, persists in prescribing Tao. For a long time when I read this story, the way I understood it was, so here is a story: Confucius encounters the hunchback tells Confucius how to do it, and Confucius turns to his followers and says, well, look, Confucius, the spokesperson, says, well, look, this is how he does it. Everyone's happy, they go home. Then something wasn't quite resolved. That you couldn't explain the hunchback, you couldn't explain how keeping one's will undivided and concentrating in spirit helps us understand or grasp what the cicada catcher has done for so long to develop his cicada catching skills. And my thinking about this passage now is that Confucius has missed the point, and he is in fact not a spokesperson for the Chuang-Tzu. He is seeking to transmit the personalized Tao of the cicada catcher, perhaps in the same way the words are encoded in Ju Quan's books. So what do the Zhuangzi stories offer? They offer many views of Tao, none of them intended as a guiding Tao. Each one is an exemplar of an individual who develops their Tao responsively in a self-so way. The individual masters are aware of their natural constitutions and their capacities. And in a way, when you read the Zhuangzi, you realize how the masters develop an awareness of their capacities through the engagement. It's very much an interdependent relationship between them and their environment. At some level, the engagement of each person with the world is personal and not generalizable. In this respect, Taoist philosophy asks us not to prescribe a Tao for everyone. Taoist Wu-Wei, non-action, refrains from asserting a grand vision for one and all. To my mind, Taoist Wu-Wei is not itself a grand vision of how to rule, but rather it exposes how the opposite approach to impose Wei initiatives to Wu is not, and to Wei is other Wei initiatives, and how these initiatives shortchange the people. I think we've seen enough examples, or heard enough now, of what Wei initiatives are. I do not imagine that an ideal society is one in which each person does their own thing, so to speak. Rather, I believe the insights of Taoist philosophy lie in its conception of Tao. There is no one absolute way for everyone. While we welcome Taoist philosophy's attention to initiative, we also need to understand its views on constraints and risks. The Zhuangzi provides exemplar to help us imagine how to navigate the world. The Zhuangzi and Warring States Taoist philosophy more generally give modern readers much work to do. It has not delivered to us a conception of Tao as a safe and desirable destination, but rather it wants us to encounter the world responsively.